Those no engine brake signs through small towns aren't really about noise, and the argument behind them, that a loaded truck can just use its regular brakes instead, is one that makes most experienced drivers genuinely uncomfortable. Because on a steep grade, with 80,000 pounds behind you, it matters. But before we get into the policy argument, let's talk about what the Jake brake actually is and how it works. Because most explanations of this either go so deep into engine mechanics that they lose people halfway through, or they stay so surface level that you walk away not really understanding anything. There's a middle ground where you can actually grasp what's happening inside the engine without needing a mechanical engineering degree, and that understanding is what makes the rest of the story make sense. So start with a basic diesel engine running normally down the highway. The engine is pulling the truck forward by burning fuel and turning the crankshaft, which turns the drive shaft, which turns the wheels. That's the simple version, and it's accurate enough for what we're doing here. Now imagine the driver lifts their foot off the fuel pedal on a downhill grade. The engine isn't getting fuel anymore, but the wheels are still turning. The truck's own weight and momentum are pushing it forward, and the drivetrain is still connected. What happens is a phenomenon that most drivers know as engine braking, where the engine creates some resistance against that motion rather than adding to it. It's the same thing you feel in a car when you downshift on a hill. The engine itself slows you down a little without you touching the brake pedal. In a gasoline engine, that natural engine braking effect is fairly noticeable because a gasoline engine has a throttle plate that closes when you lift off the fuel, and the closed throttle creates a vacuum in the intake that the engine has to fight against on every stroke. That resistance is what you feel as engine braking in a car. Diesel engines don't have a throttle plate. They control power by adjusting how much fuel gets injected rather than how much air gets in. So a diesel with no fuel going in is pulling in a full charge of air on every intake stroke, compressing it at very high pressure, and then mostly recovering that energy on the way back down. The compression resistance is there, but much of it comes back as the piston returns, which means natural engine braking in a diesel is significantly weaker than in a gasoline engine of comparable size. That's the problem the Jake brake solves. And the solution is clever enough that it's worth spending a minute on. A diesel engine compresses air at very high ratios, much higher than a gasoline engine. And at the top of each compression stroke, just before fuel would normally be injected and ignited, there's a tremendous amount of energy stored in that compressed air charge. In a normal firing cycle, fuel goes in, combustion happens, the piston gets pushed back down hard, and the engine recovers that stored energy, and then some. That's how it makes power. The Jake brake, officially called the Jacobs engine brake, named after the Jacobs manufacturing company that developed it, changes what happens at the top of that compression stroke. Instead of letting combustion happen and recovering the energy, it opens the exhaust valve right at the moment of maximum compression, just before the fuel would have fired. The compressed air vents out through the exhaust system. The energy that went into compressing that air charge is gone, released into the atmosphere as heat rather than returned to the crankshaft. And the piston, which was about to get pushed back down by combustion, instead comes back down with nothing to drive it. The engine has to pull it back up on its own against the friction and inertia of the system. Multiply that across 6 cylinders firing in sequence, each one doing the same thing. Compressing, venting, losing the energy rather than recovering it. And you get a sustained, consistent braking force that works directly against the truck's momentum without using the wheel brakes at all. The engine has been converted from a machine that adds energy to one that absorbs it, and it can do that continuously, for as long as the descent requires, without any degradation in braking force because the system generates no heat in the wheel brakes and puts no unusual stress on any component that isn't already built to handle normal engine operation. The system that makes all this happen uses engine oil pressure and a fairly simple set of hydraulic components. There's a housing mounted above the rocker arms that contains master and slave pistons. When the driver activates the Jake brake through a switch in the cab, usually a rocker switch or a stalk on the steering column, a solenoid opens and pressurized engine oil flows into that housing. As the injector rocker arm goes through its normal motion on the cam lobe, it pushes down on the master piston, builds hydraulic pressure in the oil between the pistons, and that pressure pushes the slave piston down to momentarily open the exhaust valve at exactly the right point in the compression cycle. The timing has to be precise. Open the valve too early or too late, and you lose the braking effect or create other problems. And the cam-driven timing of the system provides that precision without requiring any active control or driver input beyond the initial activation. On a fully loaded Class 8 truck coming down a serious mountain grade, The difference this makes is not subtle. I remember talking to a driver who ran the Eisenhower Tunnel stretch on I-70 through Colorado regularly. That descent on the east side drops almost 2,000 feet in a few miles, and it is genuinely unforgiving of brake fade. He described what it was like before engine braking was common on the trucks he drove, which was essentially a continuous calculation of how hard to press the brakes, when to let off and let the drums cool, watching the grade ahead to figure out whether he had enough brake left to handle what was coming. He said the Jake brake turned that stretch from something he approached with real caution into something he could manage with confidence, because he could hold the truck at a steady speed on the engine alone, and the wheel brake stayed cool and effective the entire way down. That's the practical case for the Jake brake, and it's a strong one. The physics of brake fade on a long, steep grade are not kind to loaded trucks. Drum brakes turn motion into heat, and as the drums get hotter, the friction material loses its grip progressively. By the time a driver realizes the brakes are fading, the truck is already harder to slow than it should be, and the bottom of the grade is still coming. Engine braking keeps the wheel brakes out of that equation entirely on the descent, which means they're cool and fully effective if you actually need them. For an unexpected stop, an obstacle, a traffic situation that requires sudden deceleration. The runaway truck ramps that line the descents of mountain passes across the country are an infrastructure acknowledgement that brake fade on grades is a real and recurring problem. The Jake brake doesn't eliminate the need for those ramps, but it dramatically reduces the situations where a driver ends up needing one. The sound, though, is something else. When a Jake brake is running on a large diesel engine, the rapid opening of exhaust valves across multiple cylinders produces a distinctive staccato clatter, kind of a machine gun chatter that rises and falls with the engine speed. The sound comes from the sudden release of compressed air through the exhaust on each cylinder's compression stroke, and on a large inline-six at highway speeds that's happening hundreds of times per minute. On a truck with a straight exhaust stack and no muffler, which was common on older equipment and remained popular among owner-operators for the slight power gains it offered, the sound was amplified considerably. It carried across a valley. It bounced off buildings. It rattled windows. In open country, on a two-lane highway through agricultural land, or up a mountain road, nobody particularly cared. The Jake brake was just part of the soundtrack of trucking. But as the interstate highway system routed more freight traffic through or near residential communities, and as trucks got larger and engines got bigger, the sound of a loaded truck engine braking at 2 in the morning through a neighborhood on a grade became a real quality of life issue for the people who lived there. The response from local governments was the signs. No engine brake. No Jake brake. Often with a fine attached, sometimes a few $100s, though enforcement was inconsistent almost everywhere. The signs started appearing in the 1970s and became increasingly common through the 1980s and 1990s as the issue got more attention and communities along major trucking corridors started coordinating around it. And here's where the policy question gets genuinely complicated, because the communities posting those signs were not wrong that the sound was disruptive. Anyone who's lived near a grade where trucks regularly use engine braking knows exactly what it sounds like at midnight and why it's hard to sleep through. The frustration that drove the sign campaigns was legitimate, but the solution those signs asked for, use your service brakes instead, is one that puts drivers in a difficult position on any grade that's actually steep enough to matter. The whole reason engine braking is valuable is that it keeps the wheel brakes cool and effective on sustained descents. Telling a driver not to use engine braking through a residential area that happens to sit on a downgrade is asking them to start using their friction brakes in exactly the situation where friction brakes are most likely to overheat. The driver who ignores the sign on a steep grade isn't being reckless or defiant. In many cases, they're making a straightforward calculation that a noise violation fine is preferable to the alternative, which is riding the brakes down a grade until they fade. I noticed something in looking at where these signs tend to be located, which is that a lot of them are on grades that are genuinely significant. Places where the truck is picking up speed on the way down and the driver has a real decision to make about how to manage that speed, which makes sense from the community's perspective. Those are also the locations where the Jake brake is loudest and most sustained, because the driver is going to be on it for a long time. But it also means the signs are concentrated exactly where engine braking is most justified from a safety standpoint. The legal standing of the ordinances has been questioned in a number of jurisdictions over the years. The general legal position seems to be that municipalities can regulate noise but can't effectively prohibit a specific safety system if using that system is the reasonable action for a driver on a particular grade. The fine amounts vary significantly by location, and enforcement is genuinely inconsistent. Some areas ticket actively, most don't, and drivers develop a working knowledge of which corridors are actually monitored. The sign functions more as a community statement than a practically enforceable traffic law in a lot of places. The technology response to the noise issue has been real, though. Modern exhaust mufflers specifically designed for engine brake noise have improved considerably, and manufacturers have developed exhaust brake and variable geometry turbocharger braking systems that provide engine braking force through different mechanisms and with significantly less noise than a traditional Jake brake. These systems, sometimes called compression release brakes, exhaust brakes, or in the case of turbo-based systems, variable geometry braking, don't produce the same staccato chatter because they don't involve rapidly opening exhaust valves to vent compressed air. They create braking force through back pressure in the exhaust system or through turbocharger resistance, and the result is a sustained braking effect that's considerably quieter. Modern trucks with these integrated systems, or with properly muffled traditional engine brakes, are genuinely quieter than the older equipment that created the original community backlash. The gap between what a 1985 Peterbilt with a straight stack sounded like at full Jake going through a mountain town at 3 in the morning and what a current Cascadia with a muffled compression brake sounds like on the same grade is substantial. Whether that's enough to make the sign campaigns go away is a different question. Community memory of what the problem was tends to outlast the technical improvements that addressed it, and the signs have a certain cultural momentum of their own at this point. The original development of the Jake brake is itself a pretty good story that doesn't get told often enough. Plessy Cummins, founder of the Cummins Engine Company, had a near-catastrophic experience on a California mountain grade in 1931 when the brakes on a loaded truck he was driving essentially gave out on a descent through Cajon Pass. He came within what he later described as inches of a freight train crossing at the bottom, got the truck stopped, and spent the next several decades thinking about the problem of brake fade on diesel trucks. When he retired from Cummins in 1955, he turned his attention fully to the engine braking concept he'd been developing in the back of his mind. He patented it, brought it to Jacobs Manufacturing in Connecticut, and the first production units shipped in 1961. The adoption was not overnight. Fleet operators are conservative by nature and by necessity. The consequences of putting an unproven system on working equipment are real, and the bar for demonstrating genuine benefit is appropriately high. But as units got into service and drivers and fleet managers saw what engine braking actually did for brake maintenance costs, brake lining replacement intervals, and driver confidence on mountain grades, the word spread the way useful things tend to spread in the trucking community, through drivers talking to other drivers and fleet managers comparing notes. By the 1970s, the Jake brake had become essentially standard specification on new Class 8 trucks for mountain routes. And by the 1980s, it was common across most long-haul applications regardless of terrain, because the brake wear savings alone justified the cost on high-mileage equipment, even on routes that didn't include steep grades. The math was simple enough that most fleet operators could see it clearly. Less brake wear, fewer roadside brake inspections, lower brake-related maintenance costs, and a safety margin on grades that the service brakes alone couldn't provide. ASME recognized the Jacobs engine brake as a historic mechanical engineering landmark in 1992, which is the kind of official acknowledgement that tends to come after something has already proven itself thoroughly in the real world. The sign debate, when you look at it from a distance, is really about what happens when a genuinely effective and important safety system has a side effect that's disruptive to people who live near the places it's most needed. That's not an easy problem to resolve, because both sides of it are legitimate. The drivers and safety advocates who argue that engine braking saves lives on grades are right. The residents who argue that a loaded truck running full Jake through a residential neighborhood at 2 in the morning is unacceptably loud are also right. The technology improvements that reduce engine brake noise help, but they don't fully eliminate the conflict, and the signs are likely to remain part of the American highway landscape for the foreseeable future. A reminder that the most useful solutions sometimes come with costs that fall on people who weren't part of the conversation when the solution was developed. What Plessy Cummins came up with after that terrifying drive through Cajon Pass is a piece of engineering that has kept an unknown but certainly large number of trucks from running away on mountain grades over the past 60-plus years. The drivers who use it understand what it does and what it's worth. The communities near the grades where it's most needed have a complicated relationship with the sound of it. And the signs that try to ban it sit at that intersection, not really resolving anything. but marking the place where those two realities meet on every significant grade in America.